For as long as verbal communications, the quill and the printing press have existed, human beings have been telling each other what they could or should do. Add to that the unfettered marketplace of ideas that is the internet and social media, and it becomes impossible to escape the deluge of advice, how-tos, and AI Oprahs telling you to drink pink salt and lemon juice. But what if that same internet, and perhaps a platform that posted videos, could be used to explore these ideas and arrive at a place of mutual and common understanding? Well, dear viewers, today I will shoulder that burden. So join me as we explore some of the internet's fountain pen advice right now. I'm Joshua Lax, fountain pen user, collector, bit like Ollivanders, right? And all-around fanatic. In fact, I'm so obsessed, I started a business where I get to work with other people's pens. And now, I want to share with you everything I love about the world of fountain pens. From the new pens, to the old pens, the nibs, the ink, the paper, and of course, the people. This is Uncapped.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Uncapped. Today we are talking about nib myths. And what do I mean by nib myths? And really what I'm talking about are approaches to nib smoothing or dealing with nib problems that have been put out there in the past, or maybe even as early or as late as yesterday, that for one reason or another have an issue in what is being suggested, right? So that includes things that are, anecdotally work, and you'll see what I mean as we get into things, but it's also things that just the way the technique is being suggested to you needs a little more explanation, and you'll see that in today's episode as well. A myth is something that is created to explain a reality, right? The sun rises in the morning and sets in the evening. The waves roll in and roll out. The tide changes. Fire, is created by lightning striking something dry. Whatever it is, a myth was developed to explain a reality. So there is an element in what you're going to see where things might have worked on a certain way, but that myth itself, right, that story or that explanation or that suggestion doesn't really stand the test of time and scrutiny as really the best approach to it. So you're going to see things that may actually have worked at a certain point. Someone may have tried them and it seemingly worked, or will acknowledge that it accomplished the goal they were setting out to do, but what they were doing didn't actually do things in the best way, right? So in terms of smoothing a nib, it created the feeling of a smooth nib, but the reality is that it didn't actually accomplish that and may have in fact created more problems than it sought to solve. So we're going to talk about 4 different concepts. I'm going to go through them, demonstrate things to you. We'll look at things close up as we always do. And I hope you find this interesting. A couple of things I'll say just before we get into it is, one, some of what I'm going to talk about is written out in a really excellent form in an article by Richard Binder, which I'll link below. Richard Binder is the Jedi that trained me. The other thing I want to say before we get into it is, I debated doing a video like this. I always try to present like a really positive attitude no matter what I'm feeling internally, be it rage or otherwise, because I think that that's one of the great things about our community, which is the positivity that we all share, and how we experience things together. So I didn't really want to create a video that was critical of anyone or anything, or suggest that people are, quote unquote wrong. And that's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to explore the idea of what is online. Some of it, I'm not suggesting that people are necessarily wrong, but you just need more information to do it successfully. And so at the end of this, I hope it feels more fun than just a running catalog of things I'm complaining about, because that's really not my intention. My intention is to kind of just through these various things, show you how things work, and maybe you learn something that helps in the future. So with that, let's get to it. It is time to unravel some of those nib myths you see online. I chose to use for this video a Jinhao 82 you see in front of you. The reason is that primarily we're going to be abusing this pen. So I guess if you are someone who is faint of heart and cannot tolerate a video in which a pen is abused, leave now. For the rest of you, I'll say I chose a cheap pen because we're going to do some things that I expect could easily ruin this thing. So let's get started. So I chose a Jinhao 82. I also chose a nib on the Jinhao 82 that looked a little wonky. And so I looked up at this close up. I ran my finger over it, and it looked like it had the potential to not be a great writing experience. And so I filled it, and I'm going to grab my Rhodia paper. And here it is, the Rhodia paper. And I'm just going to give you a quick writing sample and tell you what I think. So definitely more than pleasantly toothy. It's downright scratchy. I'll write it a lower angle just to get, the bottom doesn't feel great. Feels a little rough. The top that angle feels pretty good. But let's try pushing it a little bit just to see if it catches. There's a little bit of drag. Overall, it's not exactly what I would want, but it's not terrible, right? The first myth I'm going to address is an interesting one in the sense that it may not seem like much of a myth at all. But trust me when I tell you it is. And that myth is the idea that a person can just take a pen, start moving it around on an abrasive like 12,000 grit micro mesh or on 2,000 grit wet dry sandpaper, just do some movements and all is well and it writes great. And it's a myth for a couple different reasons that I'm going to explain. Now, I just want to give you one caveat here, which is I originally was going to film this portion of the video first, but I actually am filming this first part last because this nib on this pen is already completely messed up. And so the idea is that I'm now going to try and just do what you see sometimes as someone, just hits it a little bit on the paper or a little bit on the micro mesh and it's good to go, and talk you through why that doesn't exactly work. And I wanted to use the messed up nib because it illustrates the first problem with that approach. And the first problem with that approach is that if you just ink up a pen, notice that it writes scratchy, and then go rubbing it on this or this, right? You have missed a key step in the process, right? You have missed the important step of trying to identify why it is that your nib is scratchy. There isn't only one reason why you have a scratchy nib. There could be several. There could be several working in concert together. And you really want to make sure that you have actually looked at that nib and made sure it's ready to be smoothed in some fashion before you start actually taking it to an abrasive. So, for example, here, as you watch this video, you'll see the various things that I did to abuse it. And you'll see it under magnification. And what makes it scratchy is different than what makes a completely different scratchy nib scratchy, right? So if all I do is go on here and start rubbing it on the micro mesh, right? Like, I'm not really correcting what I know, because I did this to my own nib, to be the problem, right? I am simply just doing that, and you can actually hear it catching on there, right? But what's happening here, right? So you'll see a reviewer, you'll see someone, on a forum or something say, "Oh, I got the nib, it wrote a little scratchy. I just did some motions on a piece of micro mesh, etc., and it was good to go." Well, this is not really writing much different than it is when we started. And in fact, you can hear kind of that scratchiness perhaps over the video. Okay. What is happening though when they say, oh, it's good to go, it took care of the problem. Okay, sorry, that went out of focus a little bit. What's happening is this. So if someone says to you, oh yeah, I just gave it a little bit on the micro mesh, right? This is me giving this a little bit on the micro mesh, right? I'm ostensibly taking off something because this is an abrasive material. But look at what's really happening, right? You're getting this extremely wet puddle of ink gathering on the micro mesh. And what that's doing is it's basically dunking the tip of this pen in that micro mesh so that when I go and start writing with it, it's going to be extra lubricated because it has so much ink around it. But what will happen is as I continue to write, that ink will deplete. And right now, you can see barely anything's coming out. It's super scratchy, it's skipping, right? I haven't really accomplished what I set out to do. All that has happened is I've given the nib a short duration of extra lubrication that gave me the feeling that it was smooth, the appearance that it was smooth, but it wasn't actually smooth. And that's important just to recognize, if you see somebody demonstrate what I just did, then you go on your own and try it and it doesn't really seem to have an effect. I mean, that is sort of the definition of the myth, right? You try something that supposedly works, you do it, you get no effect. But then of course, you're left wondering, well, what's wrong? And it becomes more and more frustrating. The other problem with immediately just saying like, oh yeah, I just, I hit it on some sandpaper and then I went and I hit it on the micro mesh and I started writing and it was good. Again, ink is like pooled up in the front of the nib. So at first it feels good, but as you write, it gets scratchier and scratchier and scratchier, right? That is the issue with this. And the particular problem that I just created was something that I didn't mention before. But when you are going to smooth a nib, right? So if you look at I'll put that down. If you look at my fist here, right? What you want is a nib that looks like this. Like both sides, that is both of my fists, right, are identical on either side. If you start off with a nib that's slightly off kilter or slightly askew, or like what I showed in the first video where it's like one side is crusting over the other because they're out of alignment, and then you go and try and smooth that thing or you put it on abrasive, you're going to be creating uneven tines. And that is just going to deepen and deepen and deepen the problems, right? So when I talk about this myth, what I'm talking about is the idea that like you can, without checking on the condition of the nib, just go and start doing all this stuff. You see it mentioned, people don't tell you that they're looking at it. They might be, but that's an important step. So the idea that you can skip that step, I guess, is really the heart of the myth. That you can't, because you can't skip that step. You have to examine the nib under some amount of some amount of magnification to do a good job. And if not, you're going to create more problems. So that is the first myth. And ironically, I filmed it at the end because I just knew that this nib was going to be messed up from the whole course of the episode. So I hope you enjoy the further steps it took to make this pen not good. Stay tuned. Some of you at home might be saying, come on, Josh, that wasn't really a myth and you didn't really unravel anything. I dispute that, but for those of you who are doubting me at this moment, let's take this to the next step. And we are going to do the figure eights. Now, you probably have seen people say don't do figure eights. You've seen people say, I'm going to do some figure eights. They come back and they're like, oh, so much better now. And you might be saying, well, what's the problem with figure eights? Well, let's talk about the problem with figure eights. So we've dispensed with the micro mesh. That was, by the way, 12,000 grit micro mesh in the last myth. In this myth, though, we're going to go with what I use for removing material from the tipping, which is 2,000 grit wet dry sandpaper. And this stuff is fairly abrasive. Like, it will take metal off. And because I'm using this fancy 3D printed mat here, I'm going to double up the paper just to give it a little more security. So first of all, some may be saying, what is a figure eight? A figure eight is really when you do things like this. Okay. Okay. That's a figure eight. So of course, a little bit of glare. So it's those kind of like swirly things, right? Now, why is this a problem? Why is this something that we strenuously in the nib profession warn against? And that is because, well, rather than me telling you, I'm going to show you. So watch the surface of the top of the nib as I move along, right? And tell me through the screen, if you can, what the direction is of that top of the nib as I am doing the figure eights on here. And I can go one way, I can reverse. Okay. Watch, look at what's happening. It's getting broader, and that may tell us something else in a second, okay? But what you should be noticing is that that top of the nib, as I do these figure eights, is not rotating. It is not moving, okay? And I will tell you, as I'm doing these figure eights, the nib feels very smooth on this paper. Well, let's take a look at what I have done. It even looks at this kind of normal eye view like I might have smoothed it, right? And it doesn't feel scratchy anymore. Over there it does, but over here it doesn't. Oh, maybe I should hit it with a little more. Oh, there we go. Yeah. All right, does it feel scratchy over there? I don't know. Let's take a look at this under high magnification and see what's happened here.
We just basically sanded a flat surface into the tip of the nib. The other thing we did was we created uneven tines, so they're two different sizes now because we didn't check before what we were doing.
So we now know that there is a flat worn into the surface of the tip. And what will happen is, oh, that's awful. You can find a sweet spot, right? Like right over there. But if your hand moves in any other direction, I mean, this thing is broader now, which for some would be very frustrating. Going up, it's super scratchy. Going down, it's fairly scratchy. Side to side, it almost feels like it's cutting into the paper, right? And so what this has done is basically create a sharp edge all around the sides of that flat. So when you hit it in the sweet spot, it might feel smooth like it does right now. That actually feels great because I'm kind of hitting it on that one area where it's like completely flat. But if I adjust my writing for just a second, it gets super scratchy again, right? And you can see the flow is a little weird. The whole thing's a little wonky. And if I have to make notes like in an unusual position for me, which is super high, it's very scratchy. And if I wanted to underline something like that, super scratchy, it just, and as you would write, I'm just scribbling right now, but if I actually had to write, the quick, well, that looked awful. Forget that I did that. If I had to write a sentence, any of these up or side strokes or down strokes are not pleasant. I mean, that O basically felt like sandpaper writing ink. So that's the problem with the figure eight. The figure eight basically wears in a flat into the surface of the nib. Now, depending on how much damage has been wrought by this, you may find that it can be fixed with some other nib smoothing skills. But just in terms of the motion, you do not want to make figure eights. So, when people say, I'm going to make some figure eights, and then they come back and they say it's great, well, again, think that they're only writing a little bit of time at one particular angle. They're not really putting the nib through the reality of how you would use a fountain pen if you were actually writing, if you're writing in a journal, etc. Ultimately, right, doing figure eights causes more harm than good. It really just gives you kind of like a very limited space on the nib that is somehow smoother compared to other spots, but that doesn't work because when you write, you are moving your hand in ways that are not even intuitive. And as you can see, as I'm writing, like it's not really putting down ink in some strokes, and that's because the sides are digging and picking up kind of the nib as I go over, right? Now, you may say, okay, well, that's sandpaper. This doesn't do the same thing. This is a finer grit, etc. It's just for polishing. Well, polishing is removing material from the surface of the nib. So even if you are using just like a very fine grit micro mesh, I mean, I can feel it scratching on this, like it's catching into the material. You're still wearing in a flat. It's just being worn in at a slower pace, right? And so again, you may say, okay, well, I put it down. Oh, it's not too bad. I'm getting where I want to go. But if you were to look at it under magnification, you would start to be wearing in that flat. So really in either circumstance or in any circumstance, you should not use figure eights as a way to smooth nibs. In my first episode, I talked about, identifying the sharp edge and then going at it. That type of targeted work is far more reliable and far better for what we're trying to do here. For our next myth, and this is one of my favorite ones because I've never actually seen it work, and we're going to try it now. Basically, we're going to get rid of all of this, and our next myth is going to focus on this. The humble penny, soon to be a thing of the past, that my grandkids will ask us what it was like to use pennies. They may even have to ask us what it was like to use any sort of currency. But there was, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so, people pushing what they called the copper penny smoothing trick. And what I would say about that is, one, I think you're supposed to have an actual copper penny, which is harder to locate than you might think. This penny, I believe, is from 1970. It was like the oldest one I could find. I read online how to test or try and figure out if it's copper or all copper as opposed to copper mixed with zinc or aluminum or some other alloy. But there was this trick that said if you used a copper penny, you could really smooth a nib, right? And the way it worked was this. And if you Google copper penny nib smoothing, you'll see instructions on what to do. And as far as I know, what they were telling you to do was basically, with very light pressure, like go up and down. And I don't even know how they wanted you to go up and down, but to go up and down the ladder 20 to 30 times. I'm sorry, I said ladder. What they described it as going up and down the ladder. What they're basically saying is the columns on the Lincoln Memorial, you should bring the nib up and down like 30 times or something. Then when you get done with that, you should run it back and forth like I'm doing like now across the columns of the Lincoln Memorial. And then go back for a final time and rub it few times on the columns of the Lincoln Memorial. And this, my dear viewers, was said to be a great method, an undiscovered method of how to smooth a nib. So let's bring back some paper and let's see what's going on. Smooth a fresh surface here, and I'm just going to write. Oh boy. So weirdly, this feels like a different nib. And I don't know why it's inconsistent in a way, the line it's drawing. But I feel like what's happened is it's left the sharp edges that were on there from the flat, but somehow the flat itself has gotten smaller and like weirdly scratchy, but then weirdly not scratchy. So it's like shrunk the flat in some way. All right, let's have a little look under magnification, see what's going on with this bad boy.
After running it on the penny, it doesn't really look all that different. There is a pieces of paper fiber sticking out of it, so it's picking up paper. The other thing I noticed, well, two things I noticed. One is some of the nib looks more jagged. The inside of the tines looks jagged, the bottom looks jagged, but then one side looks rounded, and I don't really know what that's about, and I think we need to test further.
All right, so after looking at it under magnification, I wanted to know if I started from like sharp edges all around, like basically the what happens if you wear a flat in on the figure eight. So I just gave it some more figure eights, and I want to rerun it over the penny and see what happens with a lot more sharpness, because I didn't check the nib after our previous rounds of like moving it around and stuff on the micro mesh and the sandpaper. So I kind of just started again doing this to try and see what happened if I wore in a much sharper flat into the nib. What kind of result would we get? And that doesn't even write in one direction. If we did the penny trick on that. And I'm going to do what I normally do when I'm trying to reshape the round in the front. Just keep going, see what happens. All right. It's interesting. It definitely feels like it did something here. Again, it feels like smoother, but I feel like that's still scratchy. That's still there. That's still there. That's none better. All right, so let's take a look at this under magnification and see what's going on.
So the flat edge is still there, the sharp edges are still there. It looks to me like the tines are getting pushed closer together from this, and that's actually what's restricting the flow more. On the other hand, it does seem like certain things are more rounded, so maybe there is something abrasive happening. I don't really know.
So what is going on here? Well, as you can see, it weirdly writes like a finer line than it had been, and I gotta really press to get the line that was before. Part of it is you could see that the slit in the nib is getting clogged. Some of the skipping is just because I'm on an uneven surface, but it's writing differently and it's weird. The original proponents of the copper penny believe that there was some coating that was coming off the penny and going into the nib. The article I keep mentioning with Richard Binder explains that what's happening is that from a real copper penny, that is the actual original copper penny, little bits of the metal, I guess because it's softer than the alloy of the tip, are basically getting scraped off and then getting impregnated into the metal. And so basically what you're not really smoothing anything in either instance, whether it's a coating or the impregnation of these pieces of copper. All you're doing is putting something on it that masks the problem, but the problem with masking is that it will wear off. And so as a reliable method, and this is not reliable at all, because you could see that it sort of, I was even questioning whether this chipped at some point, the face of the nib. You're not really getting a reliable result. So that is the third myth, the myth of the copper penny. Let's move on. For our final myth, again, something that was popular in the days when Fountain Pen Network was the place to be to get information about fountain pens, is something they call the brown bag trick. And the brown bag trick, similar to the penny, was supposed to be the easy way to smooth a nib. If you were sitting somewhere and your nib was scratchy and you decided all of a sudden, hey, I'm going to smooth this nib, they were proposing that you smooth the nib on a brown paper bag. Now, I don't know exactly what they were claiming would happen as you were going through the brown paper bag. We'll talk about the effect of it in a second. But let's just say I want to try, and I'm not really doing my choice methodology here. I'm just rubbing a brown paper, or I guess rubbing the nib against a brown paper bag and seeing what happens. I mean, nothing really feels like it's coming off here, meaning the nib still feels scratchy. And we know I'm trying to re-round it, so I'm doing the moves I would do to re-round it. That's not really helping. And the idea also was that the fiber in the brown paper bag was basically akin to you being able to use sandpaper and stuff. By the way, I'm not proposing that any of the motions I'm making is the right way to smooth a nib. I'm just don't really know what else you would do on this. I mean, I guess I could do my chosen method. I feel like a pretty sharp edge right there is getting caught. Whether it's smoothed out, don't really know. This looks like there's a lot more ink flow at the very bottom. I wonder what's going on there. See in a second. All right, you get the picture. Just curious what happens. Oh, it's actually cutting the paper. All right, let's have a look at this under magnification.
So we can see that the flat is still there, the sharp edges are still there. The paper bag really had no capacity to actually help us with the things causing us the problem. Maybe there's a little abrasiveness, but I don't think it had any real effect.
All right, well, like everything, we're going to test how this writes. For that, I'm going to bring back my paper. By the way, one of the things you'll see in the Richard Binder article is that you should always use the same ink and paper whenever you're nib smoothing. I always use Rhodia. I like Rhodia because it is, I'm not sure if it's coated, but you definitely feel grain against it, and I find that it really gives you a good way to pick up on any issues the nibs are having. Even if it feels smooth, you can usually feel every little nick. So, I will acknowledge that there is some abrasive power in this paper bag. However, it actually feels scratchier than it did with the penny. And I'm still feeling a lot of sharp edges and not sure really what I've accomplished here. I guess it's better in some ways, but not really. Not really better. And as I could see, it's still dealing with that flat, right? So the flat is clearly there, and that is the issue. All right. Well, what is supposed to happen with the paper bag? Again, it's supposed to be an abrasive, so it's supposed to have the same power as your basic sandpaper, I guess, because it's rough, and frankly, comparing it, this is a little rougher, but this is also feels fairly rough. The problem is a couple things. First of all, this is not made in any sort of precision way. So it's got fiber, and maybe I pick up another bag and it really wears down the nib really quickly. So I don't actually know what the grit is going to be at any given time on that. So that's a problem. Second, like the copper penny, some of the smoothing power is I probably put paper fibers into any sort of like little gouges in the face of the nib, like micro gouges, not like a big chip. So some of it may feel kind of smooth because I've actually I've allowed paper fibers to impregnate. But what's going to happen with paper fiber? Paper fiber is going to get wet from the ink, it's going to get engorged, and then it's going to deteriorate, and then I'll be back to normal. The other thing that's happened, at least with this nib, is it hasn't actually corrected what's causing the scratchiness, which is sharp edges all around the sides. Lastly, there's a concern with the paper fibers getting into the nib and feed, because as you're doing this, I didn't really endeavor to really pick up fiber, but theoretically as you're doing that, it's going to pick up paper fibers, and what'll happen is it'll go into the slit, it'll stop writing, and it's not going to be as easy as just flushing the pen out to get rid of it. Potentially you're going to have to floss it out. That leads you to other things, and so what really is perhaps less reliable in some ways, or maybe more reliable on one level but less reliable than the copper penny, is the paper bag. So the message with it is it's a myth, because yes, it has some capacity to make a nib feel smoother, but the reality is it's not really accomplishing anything. If anything, it's illusory, meaning it's just momentary, and it has a lot more problems than it solves. So that is the brown paper bag trick debunked. So my goal today was to kind of look at some of the stuff you see out there, and just kind of give people what are the missing pieces, or what is the rest of the story as it relates to some of this stuff. Because again, I think that one of the most frustrating things that can happen is you have a problem with a pen, you're trying to figure it out, you go online, you get advice from various sources. Some of it is incomplete, some of it is not described well, some of it is downright wrong, because it doesn't really accomplish, or it may not even match the problem you have. And then you give it a try and it doesn't work, and the frustration grows, which is not really what being a fountain pen user is all about. Being a fountain pen user is, all about the enjoyment of the pen. So part of what I want to do is I want to give you information so that you can judge where it comes from. And again, I really am a big believer, and this is how I was trained, that the best way to ensure that you are getting the best results is to really have a loop, learn to use it, and just inspect and investigate the pen, and make sure you are confident in what the issue is. And that's why I tend to always start with, well, what's the problem? And then get into, well, what are we going to do to fix it? The kind of just throwing things out under the misnomer that something is scratchy. It's not really a misnomer, but just the overall umbrella that something is scratchy. I think you sometimes see stuff that leads you to believe that if you just do a couple things like smooth it on micro mesh, run it over a paper bag, whatever it is, that somehow is going to fix it. It may do something that helps. I'm not disputing that wouldn't happen, but it doesn't necessarily mean you've gotten to the root of it. And if you've had one success with something like this, or seemingly success for some period of time, doesn't mean it's going to work next time. And hopefully, obviously, there is no next time, but you never know. We all tend to get a lot of pens. So that is what today's video was about. So I called it myths, but and having gone through all the motions of it and talked it out with all of you, I feel like I've gotten to the point where I feel like it's really about just filling in the blanks on some of it, but also giving you the information about why or why not something is a viable option to address a problem. So with that being said, I hope that, this video has given you more answers than it has questions. Coming up, I'm going to be moving away from things specifically focused on nibs to showing you some other stuff. So I hope that, you've subscribed or will subscribe, so you're ready to get that video when it drops. If you like today's video, please and I look forward to speaking to you about more and more exciting fountain pen and stationery things in the future. Thank you so much. See you all soon.